Yes, thank you, Wilson, and good morning to our media friends. Meron din pala akong estudyante rito, Wilson, no?
Ah, wow.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can I share
Yes.
your
Okay, as
screen?
it's a sharing.
So I'd like to start my, actually it's not an opening statement, but I don't even want to call it a lecture.
An
But
analysis.
later, I'd like to start with I consider very important facts, documented important facts to enable everyone to understand the context, no? Understand the context of the Ukrainian crisis and why Russia under Vladimir Putin was forced to intervene. I don't call it invasion, but intervention by Russia. So let me begin with the year 1991. My fact box is about or focuses on violations by the US, NATO, and Ukraine, no? That collectively have deepened Russia's security border concerns. No? So in 19, let me start with 1991. I suppose every one of us knows that this is the year when the Cold War or the bipolar power competition between the U.S. and the USSR ended with the disintegration of the former Soviet Union. Now, with the disintegration of the Soviet Union, that left Russia, known today as the Federation of Russia, Ukraine, the second biggest republic of the Soviet Union, and 11 other separate republics. That is a very important historical note. The following year, uh, Paul Wolfowitz was the defense secretary of the U.S. Came out with his now called the Wolfowitz Doctrine. He said, and I'm quoting the doctrine itself, the US should prevent any other country from dominating any region of the world that might be a springboard to threaten unipolar and exclusive US global dominance. I think this is a very important, significant fact because it will show us that uh, it will show us that uh, the main strategy of the U.S. From there on was to prevent any rising major powers, including Russia and China, from what they call replacing the U.S. as the global hegemonic power. No? In well, 4 years later, in 1996, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, this is the steps that were taken by NATO in expanding its membership and hence expanding its deployment of forces, including nuclear missiles, contrary to an agreement with the former Soviet Union. So by that year, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, remember these were the former member states of the Eastern Europe, no? Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and then in 2009, they added Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. These are former Soviet republics, as well as Albania and Croatia in 2009. Okay, now the following year, I don't know if you are familiar with this name. He is actually a historical name already. He died 10 years ago, no? By the name of George Kennan. George Kennan was the director of the policy planning staff of the U.S. State Department in 1949. So he is considered a top diplomat and the architect of the 1949 containment strategy against the Soviet Union. You know, containment strategy that included engaging the Soviet Union with arms competition, economic alliances, military alliances to encircle the Soviet Union. And he says, this is 1997, he says, expanding NATO would be the most fateful error of American policy in the post-Cold War era. Such a decision will inflame the nationalistic, anti-Western, and militaristic tendencies in Russian public opinion. And he goes further. I think it is the beginning of a new Cold War. The Russians will react quite adversely and it will affect their policies. This is a tragic mistake. So that is a quote from George Kennan. So he was, well, in his twilight years, he was somewhat in a position who would like to advise and encourage the American policymakers to remember history. Now, Boris Yeltsin, the first president of Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, in fact, denounced by saying that the eastward expansion of NATO is a mistake and a serious one at that. The following year, ito na yung ginawa ng NATO. No? NATO started bombing Yugoslavia and dropped an accumulated number of 28,000 bombs. And Yugoslavia was a Russian ally. Let me show you some maps that will indicate the expansion of NATO. Of course, NATO is led by the US, and the US, the leading member, and the NATO was founded under the so-called Washington Treaty of 1949. Okay. This particular map will show Russia is here, Ukraine is here, the NATO expansion is here. No, these are the former NATO members or original founding members, and then they added members here. They were supposed to target Ukraine, the neighboring country of Russia, to become also a member of NATO. Without knowing or whether they knew or not, that would be a red line as far as the Russian Federation is concerned. Now another map. Okay, so the expansion here you included Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovenia, Hungary. Of course, the original members: Iceland, Norway, UK, Germany. So many, more than 20 member countries of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and they were part of an encirclement strategy. Now, the encirclement strategy of NATO should be understood as the one that George Kennan, which I mentioned earlier, warned that it will enrage Russia and it will endanger and inflame the historically security concerns of Russia. Meron pa ba? Ito pa. Oh. So I'm showing to you the stationing, deployment, and existence of so many US bases near Russia. Of course, this is just a part of the big network of American bases deployed all over the world. Even if the Cold War had already ended in 1990. So the question is now raised: why keep on stationing bases, maintaining bases that threaten the security of many countries, including China? In February 2007, during a Munich conference, Vladimir Putin, who was already the president of Russia by the time, said NATO expansion does not have any relation with the modernization of the NATO alliance itself or with ensuring security in Europe. On the contrary, it represents a serious provocation. Please remember that phrase: a serious provocation that reduces the level of mutual trust between NATO and Russia. So he was already ringing the alarm bell to NATO not to do that. But by 2007, NATO kept on expanding and distributing uh, arms stocks arsenal to those countries, including, by the way, nuclear missiles. Now, had Ukraine been a member of NATO, therefore, today, um, I would not, I can imagine how Ukraine will react with by launching nuclear missiles on Russia, and that will be a catastrophic war in the whole of Europe. 7 years later, and this is the important one, the US, through the CIA, instigated the so-called Maidan Revolution that led to the ouster of the democratically elected neutralist president Viktor Yanukovych and install a pro-US government. In 2019, or 5 years later, Volodymyr Zelensky, a pro-US politician, actually he used to be a comedian before he became a politician, took over in 2019. The following year, in 2015, excuse me, 2015, the Minsk II agreement was signed uh, by Ukraine and some organizations, which provided for, among others, it called for a dialogue on interim government for the Donetsk and Lugansk regions in eastern Ukraine. These are the the areas that are populated by ethnic Russians, And by this time until today, the ethnic Russians were the victims of atrocities and killings and shellings coming from neo-Nazis. There are really neo-Nazis in the Ukraine. Uh, it also called for the withdrawal of all foreign armed formations, military equipment, and mercenaries. It called for a constitutional reform in Ukraine, including decentralization with specific mention of Donetsk and Lugansk, and that elections would be held in both areas based on terms to be agreed with their representatives. Now, last December, an enraged, beleaguered Vladimir Putin warned the NATO countries, saying that, quote, "You promised us in the 1990s that NATO would not move an inch to the east, but you cheated us shamelessly." So it took about one more month before Russia would send its troops on February 24, or 5 days ago, and that sparked the skirmishes. And today, the rumbling of Russian tanks and so on and so forth. The Russian forces knocked out. No, they were able to knock out 144 military installations in Ukraine. They were also able to knock out 33 command centers. Now, let me go to my short analysis in reference to today's ongoing Ukraine war. There are three reasons that force Vladimir Putin, as president of Russia, to send troops to to Ukraine. First off, the first reason is that it's on the energy issue. You know that Russia had forged an agreement, or had already built a natural gas pipeline from Russia directly to Germany. Directly to Germany. But the US has become a major natural gas supplier, and it felt aggrieved by the fact that an ally like Germany would choose instead to forge an energy agreement with Russia. Of course, the main reason there is that the Russian natural gas was 4 times cheaper, no, or even 5 times cheaper than the U.S. natural gas. So naturally, who would not choose the cheaper commodity? Pero ayaw ng US yan. Number two reason, there has been a strong Ukrainian lobby in the US Congress in collaboration or with the support of neocons in the US Congress, conservatives both from the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, most of whom are, associated with the powerful military-industrial complex in the US, including NATO countries. And the Ukrainians were calling for military intervention by NATO against Putin. The third reason is the domestic troubles of President Biden. You know that Biden, the US in November this year will have a midterm elections, and it looks like the Democratic Party will be beaten by the Republican Party again, in the light of the low credibility rating of Biden and his mismanagement of the COVID-19 pandemic, the unemployment in the US, and other reasons. So those are the reasons, and that is my own narration of the events that will explain to us clearly about this Ukrainian crisis. Thank you very much, Wilson.
Thank you very much, Professor Bobby Tuason, for a very detailed and thought-provoking presentation and analysis. Later on, we'll ask questions and we welcome media questions. We'll ask now the next speaker, Dr. Romel Banlawi, Chairman of the Philippine Institute for Peace, Violence, and Terrorism, to give his opening statement. He's also a top geopolitics analyst, Professor Romel Banlawi. Welcome. Paki-unmute niya si Professor Romel Banlawi. Dr. Romel Banda. Yan. Thank
Yan.
you. Thank you.
Thank you very
Welcome.
much, Wilson, for the
Yes.
great.
Internet.
Kaya nag-froze siya.
Nag-freeze siya sandali. We'll wait for him for a few minutes, for a few seconds. We'll wait for him now. Please be ready with your questions, and you can message the chat box or text me directly. The latest news, I think, is the Ukrainian government has agreed to meet to talk to Russia. We'll wait for Dr. Romel Banlawi.
I was going to add that.
Yes,
Wilson.
yes. Thank you, Professor.
So Russian negotiators are already in Belarus waiting for their counterpart from Ukraine.
Yes.
So there appears to be already some talks being organized. No?
Thank you for your reminders, Professor Bobby Tuason, kasi without your presentation, I totally forgot about Yugoslavia. I don't know, maybe I totally forgot about all the bombings. I have an idea. There was an embassy bomb. I did not know the whole country was bombed pala.
Yeah, the embassy of China was bombed also.
Yes. And I'm shocked na it was bombed like Laos and Vietnam pala.
Wilson.
Yes.
Dr. Banlawi is already okay.
Okay na. Yes, welcome, Professor.
Dr. Banlawi, the screen, can you put it
yes, we have to adjust it lang. Baliktad konti, Professor.
Yan. Yeah. Ay, baliktad pa rin.
Yes.
Vertical.
Yan.
Okay.
You look well na. Welcome, Professor Romel Banlawi.
Again, sorry of issues.
Yes, welcome.
Now I'm using my cellular phone data to attend this. Yeah. So as I said earlier, we have to understand the Ukrainian crisis as also a expression of major power rivalry between the United States and the former Soviet Union, which is currently right now is Russia. And the attack against Ukraine is not only an attack against Ukraine, but also an attack against the United States and its allies in Western Europe. So you have to understand the Ukrainian crisis in the context of major power rivalry. Second, the Ukrainian crisis is not only about major power rivalry, but also a competition between two major political systems, the democratic system and the so-called non-democratic world. And they regard Russia as a threat to the existence of the United States and Western Europe because of its non-democratic institutions. And the main purpose of the US and Western Europe in expanding to Ukraine and other parts of Eastern Europe is precisely to promote democracy in that part of the world and to also encircle Russia to also adopt a democratic system according to the wishes of the United States and its allies in Western Europe. Now the question is, why is it that Russia is willing to let other countries in Eastern Europe to enter the European Union and NATO, and why not Ukraine? As I mentioned earlier, many Baltic states have already joined the European Union and have joined the NATO, but why Vladimir Putin will not allow Ukraine to be under the shadow of the European Union and NATO, more so under the shadow of the United States? There is one major reason. Reason one, Ukraine and Russia shared a long shared history. In fact, they have the same father in Kiev. You know, the Ukrainian nation and the Russian nation developed simultaneously in the past, and they have the same father, so to speak. They belong to the same father. And however, Ukraine decided to stand alone after the breakdown of the former Soviet Union in 1991 when it declared independence. But even prior to that, Ukraine has always been part of Russian influence. It was put under the Russian Empire before the First World War, and became part of the former Soviet Union during the Cold War. So Russia cannot let go of Ukraine because of sentimental, historical, and even what I call genetic reason, because they the Russians consider the Ukrainians as integral part of its history and DNA. And of course, Ukraine also is located in a strategic position, and allowing Ukraine to be put under the shadow of the United States, NATO, and Western Europe will also put Russia in a very disadvantaged position. So Russia cannot allow Ukraine to provide access to these Western powers to strategically encircle Russia. So if you have seen the actions of Russia right now, Russia is willing to risk the security of the whole world, because for Russia, the most important it is national security interest, and that is why China articulated very well the security predicament of Russia by stating that Russia has legitimate security concerns, and these legitimate security concerns are not appreciated by the Western powers. They are not sensitive to the security predicaments of Russia. They are the United States, European Union, and NATO are just interested to win this, strategic competition against Russia. And for me, Vladimir Putin will really adopt a hardline position if the United States, Western Europe, will insist on recruiting Ukraine to be a member of the European Union and NATO. Vladimir Putin will not allow an independent Ukraine under the shadow of Western powers. So Vladimir Putin will only allow an independent Ukraine if first, the very least, if Ukraine will play a neutral position, or if Ukraine will adopt a pro-Russian position. That's all for now, Wilson. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Dr. Romel Banlawi. Very interesting. Our two speakers have crystallized and explained to us very clearly pala the underlying reasons for the actions of Putin. Thank you. Without the two explaining it, reading the Western media and international media, akala ko Putin is irrational, doing all this totally out of ego or something. Let's invite three reactors to give their reactions, and then we will open the floor for media questions. First, we'll ask, ladies first, Professor Ana Malindog-Uy, analyst, Phil Briggs, strategic studies, also columnist of ASEAN Post, to give her reaction, and also to share the thoughts of General Victor Corpus. He messaged me yesterday his thoughts. He has an appointment today, or else he would have wanted to share his thoughts. Miss Ana Malindog-Uy, your reaction. Okay, unmute si Miss Ana, yes.
Okay. Thank you, Wilson, for that nice introduction, and also thank you also for having me in this public forum on Ukraine crisis impact on Asia and the Philippines. Since we're talking about Asia and the Philippines in terms of impact, let me deal with that. No, kasi the other two speakers already explained more on the geopolitical considerations, why this is happening, the crisis is happening. So true enough, the Philippines may be far from Ukraine. Nonetheless, what's going on in that part of the world is affecting the country and the rest of the world without exception. The possible further escalation of Ukraine poses a threat not only to Europe's economic and financial stability, but to the world at large, especially to the developing world, or like us, Philippines, we're part of the developing world. One of that would be the economic consequences. There are two possibilities to that. You have what you call the inflation, in terms, especially on oil, and at the same time, the disruption in the supply chains, or what you call global supply chains. So in terms of oil, of course, because of that crisis, definitely prices of oil in the international market will rise up. And at the same time, prices of commodities in local markets, like here in the Philippines, will also shoot up. So that's a big problem, I think, or it's not really, probably a big problem for our government to see and for us also to look at. So how we going to mitigate this situation, because it will affect us in that sense. The other one is much more on the supply chain, no? Because if you look at the world is interdependent. Raw materials and products and oil, like for example, wheat, actually are, most of it comes from Ukraine and Russia. So if there will be war in there, or right now there's a military intervention in there, of course there's a possibility that the whole global supply chains will be affected. And what will be the impact of that? Again, the impact of that will be inflation, or it means pagtaas ng presyo ng mga bilihin, especially goods that has, goods being exported by Russia and Ukraine, and that includes many. Actually, if you look at it, if you take note, Russia is the third largest petroleum producer. It is the second natural gas producer globally, accounting for nearly 17% of supply in 2022. It exports more than 35% of its production, and about 70% is delivered to Europe by pipeline. Yun ini-explain kanina ni Professor Bobby. And Russia is not only the world's most significant suppliers of fertilizer when you talk about agriculture and related materials, but but also natural gas, copper, aluminum, and other essential commodities. And also Russia and Ukraine produce nearly a quarter of the world's wheat, a vital ingredient used to make bread and pasta and other products. No, like for example, pandesal, common in bakery, you need it. So that's one thing, no. And so these are the looming ramification of the ongoing crisis in that part of the world, which definitely it will affect us. But on the other note, it's one thing to consider the so-called economic consequences, but also we need also to draw, because this is the most important, I think. What lessons can we draw from the experience of Ukraine, which is something of great value and deserves consideration. To quote the former chief of the intelligence service of the Armed Forces of the Philippines, Brigadier General Victor Corpus, sabi niya, the abandonment of Ukraine by the US and its NATO allies will also affect the US-China rivalry focused on the Taiwan issue. If the US and its entire NATO allies could abandon Ukraine to face Russia by all its lonesomes, being alone in there, ang tanong dito is, could the same fate be waiting for Taiwan when China finally makes its move to unify the motherland? Sa akin naman, ang reaction ko naman dito, since I'm the reactor, the Philippines, on this note, the Philippines, ang sa akin, should avoid following the footsteps and avoid the fate of Ukraine. The country, again, should refuse and prevent at all costs the possibility of being a proxy or a pawn of any superpower in their proxy wars. It must avoid being used as a pawn by any superpower to encircle another superpower. We should avoid being in the front line of any military confrontation and competition consequential to the power struggle of superpowers, which is not to our advantage and that's not the country's core national interest. Similarly, amid the volatile and ever-changing geopolitical realities in the Indo-Pacific region and other parts of the globe, ASEAN must remain a region of peace, progress, stability, and most importantly, stay a nuclear-free zone. Likewise, ASEAN member state must be consistent and steadfast in upholding ASEAN centrality, meaning ASEAN's role in the regional security architecture, regional order, and the power dynamics between and among external powers that have interest in the region. In addition, this is the last thing, the only way for Ukraine crisis to come to a halt is for US and NATO not to ignore Russia's security demands, legitimate security demands and concern. For Ukraine, I think, as what Professor Banlawi said, try to see if it, in terms of being neutral or consider what you call neutrality, and also for negotiation, dialogues, and diplomacy to resume. It's before it's too late. Ukraine and Russia must go back to the negotiating table for the sake of the people and the world. The world cannot afford to bear another world war, while at the same time, it is still trying to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. On this note, I would like to say thank you to everyone for coming, and thank you, Wilson, as well for inviting me. Maraming salamat po at mabuhay po tayong lahat.
Thank you, Ana Malindog Uy, for your reaction. Next, we would like to invite Mr. Herman Laurel, Director of Field Brick Strategic Studies, for his reaction. Afterwards, Professor Aportadera, then media questions.
Good morning.
Mr. Laurel.
Reply first to our esteemed colleague from Iloilo, Yomil Aportadera, because I'm very, very eager to hear from him.
Siya mauna. Yes, yes.
Mauna, sige.
Sige. Dr. Yomil Aportadera, who is a respected doctor, lawyer, and professor of University of San Agustin, Iloilo. Welcome, Dr. Yomil Aportadera. Paki-unmute si Dr. Aportadera. Paki-unmute, please. Yes.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
We could hear you.
Okay.
Yes.
So, good morning. I would like to start by expanding.
Pakilakas konti lang yung sound niya.
Okay. I want to start by expanding on what Professor Romel mentioned about the historical ties of the three countries, Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine.
Yes.
In the past, these three countries formed a loose confederation known as Kievan Rus, a term that Vladimir Putin has recently been mentioning more frequently in his recent speeches, referring to the quotation mark ancient Rus nation. It was a loose confederation of Kievan Rus that saw its golden period just before the invasion of the Mongolian hordes in that area. It never recovered, and eventually the part of Ukraine became under the influence of several empires, including that of the Ottoman Empire, and even became part of the province of the then Polish and Lithuanian Confederacy. So in that light, we will move forward eventually to what is now in the 21st century. Professor Romel and Professor Bobby Tuason mentioned about the historical facts background since the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Actually, from what they talk, we can now have a sense that we are being introduced to what is now called the Putin Doctrine. Almost 200 years ago, President Monroe unilaterally formulated the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. It was at the time of the continuous quest for independence of the South American republics that Monroe, fearful of a possible French and Spanish alliance to reimpose colonization in the Western Hemisphere, particularly in South America, came out with the Monroe Doctrine that literally and eventually prevented European adventurism in its sphere of influence in South America. In fact, Simon Bolivar, known as the liberator of South America, welcomed that Monroe Doctrine with gratitude, something that future or present generation of South America may not necessarily agree with American interference in that area. Before I go into the three elements of the Putin Doctrine, I would like to mention the four periods of eras in Russia foreign policies since the dissolution or disintegration of the Soviet Union. These are first, the period from the dissolution to 1995. The second period is from 1999 from 2000 to 2018, and from 2018 to December 2019, and the fourth period, which is the present, which is now called constructive destruction policy as termed by Sergei Karaganov of the Council of Foreign and Defense Policy of Russia. So we go first to the first period of the era, and Russia policymakers always call this a period of weakness and delusions. Russia lost the will to fight. It was the allure of democracy and what Russia can learn from liberal, democratic, and capitalist ideas. But it was not all lost, because during that era, Russia was still able to maintain its permanent membership in the UN Security Council and was able to keep its nuclear arsenal intact, and even was the beneficiary of whatever nuclear arsenal stored in Ukraine they were eventually turned over to Russia. Among the so-called treaties that Russia was forced to enter into as concession being considered weak at that era, which would have reminded us also by recent of our more or proximate history here in China, which is the century of humiliation or being imposed upon a weak state, are first, the Charter of Paris for New Europe in 1990. Its pertinent provision is the freedom of association, which paved the way for NATO expansion and is now considered by Russian policymakers as a backstabbing move during a time. It was then that there was a shift from NATO, from being a purely defensive coalition to that of an aggressive actor, from actions in Yugoslavia, Iraq, and Libya. Secondly, there is the 1997 Founding Act of Mutual Relations, Cooperation, and Security with NATO, which Russia was forced to sign. It was also known as Partnership for Peace Program. It legitimized the 1990 Charter of Paris, wherein NATO expansion, despite several violations in their pledge not to deploy large military units to new member states, which I think Professor Bobby Tuason identified, Estonia, Poland, etc. This another provision of this founding act or Partnership for Peace was to establish a nuclear-free zone in NATO border states with Russia. This is nothing for Russia, as eventually you will notice in recent developments, especially last night, that because for Russia policymakers, US has always distanced itself from nuclear conflict to protect its allies. The US will not risk its cities being bombarded by nuclear bombs in the event of a local nuclear conflict, even in Europe. So in that light, I would like to mention recent events, because with the deployment of several advanced and specialized forces of NATO in border states and new member states of NATO bordering Russia, Vladimir Putin activated Russia's nuclear deterrent force last night. This was in response to the possible invocation of NATO Article 5 that any attack, including cyber attacks, which they would want to claim being instigated by Russia against Poland, a new member state, would be a justification for NATO involvement in Ukraine, and this will raise the ante in that region. Another aspect salient treaty was the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, which Professor Tuason mentioned about in the Minsk Agreement, that it was to oversee the ceasefire in Ukraine brought about by the breakaway republics of Luhansk and Donetsk. It was on paper a very ideal move, making a common European security system. It would be, however, dominated by NATO and EU, and according to Russian foreign policy makers, it is influenced by Western political values and standards. Some of them are strange or foreign to Russian values and traditions. Let me go to the second era or period in the four eras of Russian foreign policy since the disintegration of the Soviet Union. This period was between 2000 to 2018. This was started with the abrupt withdrawal of the United States from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty of 1972. So President George Bush notified its withdrawal, and the withdrawal took effect by June after 6-month period by June of 2002. So Russia, while appearing friendly and humble, started to rebuild itself, especially in armaments, most especially because for Russia, it was the rationale of American withdrawal from the ABM Treaty was that it frees and allows America for a possible nuclear first strike against any enemies, Russia included. So in that light, Russia started to rebuild itself. So Russia began to develop weapons to challenge U.S. strategic dominance. In fact, in the Munich speech, which Professor Bobby Tuason mentioned, Russia was already criticizing the unipolar global power stance of America in undertaking military actions unilaterally against possible threats to their so-called hegemony. You may remember missile strike in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Tunisia, in Libya. They were all unilateral actions and part of American hegemonic policies. Okay. The events, however, under this back to greatness period of 2000 to 2018 also coincided with the global economic crisis, an event that the West, especially as seen from now, the Western capitalism never recovered. And as Richard Sakwa, an economist, mentioned, it marked the end of Western globalist expansion. Other events of significance during this period is the annexation of Crimea and Syria, the rise of China, and the initial pivot to the east under the Putin Doctrine. And locally, we saw the ascension of President Duterte as President of the Philippines, a period in which during his 6-year term saw a dramatic rise in trade and bilateral relations between Russia and the Philippines that has never been seen in 20 years since the disintegration of the Soviet Union. The third period or era is the plateau period, and which was from 2019 to December 2021 recently. It continued the modernization of Russia under the so-called principle that they would dominate escalation scenario in case of conflicts within Russia's sphere of influence. Note, it is being applied now in Ukraine. It also marked a weak economy in Russia during this period. And it was at this time that Russian policymakers were even afraid and feared that this period would be another quotation mark. Russia would snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. And we go into the constructive destruction period, which is the fusion, the introduction of the so-called Putin Doctrine. It started in December 2021, when Vladimir Putin issued an ultimatum against NATO and US expansion in Russia's backyard. The message was that it was to stop developing military infrastructure near Russian border. It would then mark this constructive destruction, would then mark the paradigm of relations of Russia with the West. It is premised also on the slow but inevitable decay of US and Western system. Now, we go, what are the three elements of this Putin Doctrine? We can see it now in what is in the Ukraine conflict. Number one, the use of various foreign policy instruments, including military actions, to establish red lines. As Professor Bobby Tuason mentioned, the red lines as to the expansion into Ukraine. It involves military, political, psychological, and military technical pressure, which will include cyber attacks. And in this light, there is no fear of escalation of confrontation. Remember how Putin declared a warning to other states not to get involved and did not rule out the use of nuclear force as protagonists in this conflict. Russia may rightfully say so. It has a history of defeating powers with imperial ambitions. From Sweden, which Russia defeated in Poltava. France, we all know, it's not winter, but the Russian determination in Borodino that defeated Napoleon and his Republican armies. And more recently, we are all well aware of the siege of Stalingrad and it as the turning point of World War II and eventual Allied victory. The second element to this Putin doctrine is the pivot to the east, or otherwise known as the East-oriented quotation mark policy. It also called for the development of Siberia and a friendship with China. This friendship of China is something that the USSR never had because it considered China as a rival in its sphere of influence amongst the communist states throughout the world in the struggle for in the spread of communism then. And secondly, we are all well aware that up to 1 million of troops on each side were massed along the Sino-Russian borders as a part of their conflict. Now, Russia could save that, could spare that 1 million troops and face any NATO expansion or adventurism. More recently, there is a 30-year contract to supply China with gas through a new pipeline. There are now suggestions among foreign policy makers for a 5-year military pact with China, which of course would mean a lot of concerns and fear among Western powers. It is still in the pipeline. The third element is the so-called decolonization of Russian thought. In Russian history, from Peter the Great, in establishing St. Petersburg, Russia has been enamored with European styles. In fact, French was the language of the imperial court in St. Petersburg. And you can see some monuments there following even that of the Sanssouci Castle of France in St. Petersburg. So from these so-called foreign ideas and foreign ideologies, the Putin Doctrine wants to liberate Russia and Russian thought from what he called the shadow of imported Marxism of Marx of Germany and the fascination with liberal democracy. I think, thank you.
Thank you very much for the reaction of Dr. Leomil Aportadera. Next, thank you very much for daming information. Mr. Herman Laurel reaction, and then we have a lot of media questions for our speakers and reactors.
Yeah, I'm going to
Mr.
try
Herman
to.
Laurel of Philbricks Strategic Studies.
Yes, I'm going to try to keep this down to 10 minutes, and I appreciate your mail and everybody else's comprehensive presentation about the complete Ukraine situation. But I'd like to start with some answers to two questions here that I've seen in the chat box. So I anticipate later on, and the others will have more time to answer the questions.
Yes, there are
From
more questions.
Adlawan, his question is my question. How widespread is or was the protest of Russian people against the aggression of Russia in Ukraine? What is the stand of socialist China, Cuba, Venezuela? I think the socialist countries and the non-aligned countries are one, including India. Please note, including India, have not supported the U.S. resolution to condemn the Russian. I do not call it invasion, but action.
Including the Philippines, I think.
Including the Philippines, which is very noteworthy, and I want everybody to praise President Duterte for maintaining the independent foreign policy in this particular case and to save our OFWs. No? So yung Russian protest sa loob ng Russia, there will always be elements there, and that goes to prove that Russia is not autocratic, it is democratic. But at the same time, I want to remind everybody that there are so many amboys, like in the Philippines, American boys inside Russia, funded by George Soros, National Endowment for Democracy, and so on. So this is understandable. Another question from V. Fennis to everyone. Ang usapin po ng kasalinlan ng mga sovereign nations, right to self-determination of Ukraine and other nations in the world in the midst of global power competition. Salamat. There are 2 points that are important here. First of all, Donetsk and Luhansk are also invoking the right to self-determination, which Russia and these two breakaway regions were willing to compromise for autonomy under the Minsk agreement. But the NATO, the European Union, and the United States kept on postponing any answer to this, hanging like a hanging fruit, keeping Russia in limbo, which finally frustrated Russia and led to this situation today. Okay, those three issues settled. Let me just give again what I gave in the last media forum natin. This is a much broader historical part of a historical process of the shift from the bipolar world to the unipolar world in 1991. Okay, so in 1991, the bipolar world collapsed, and there was a new unipolar world, a single superpower in the world, which went on to believe that they could create the 21st century as their century. That's why in 1995, Robert Kagan and Billy Crystal, neoconservatives in the U.S., wrote the Project for a New American Century, which was the guideline for the subsequent administrations in the U.S., including Bush, which started the war on terror on false pretext 9/11. But and that's very clear that it was a false pretext because they attacked Afghanistan, not because Afghanistan was involved in the 9/11 terror attack, but because Afghanistan is a key strategic region in the Belt and Road, because it is the only area that China's Belt and Road has not gained access to. So that's one. And then the other region, of course, Iraq, they attacked also for false reasons, which is the weapons of mass destruction that did not exist. So that was the start of the war on terror, and a few years later, General Wesley Clark explained that he heard from the generals that he was talking to that the U.S. would attack 7 countries in 7 years, which included Libya, Syria, and so on and so forth. So that was all part of a plan to make the 21st century the American century. Unfortunately, this has not happened. 2008 saw the rise of China and the collapse of the U.S. financial system. That's where Obama and the neoconservative clique conceived or actively implemented the pivot to Asia. And then in 2014, the Maidan. Now, I have some images here, 3 images. I'm not yet really very good in share screen, but I don't know if your staff, si Clarissa or Aya, have prepared it. Can you share the screen?
Share screen.
I'll just explain the images as you post them.
Clarissa and Aya.
Meron na?
Yes.
Ano
Share
bang,
screen.
meron na ba? Kung hindi natin magawa, it's okay.
Nakita na ba yung screen? Hindi pa.
Hindi ko kita pa rito.
Hindi pa nakikita yung screen.
I have 3 images. I have 3 images that I shared.
Pwede pakita yung screen.
Kaya ba, Aya or Clarissa? Kaya ba?
Share screen, paki-share. Nasaan yung 3 screen?
Isa-isa lang, 1 by 1.
What? Bakit? Ay, wala daw kayo na-send?
Ano, wala? Okay.
Wala kayong na-send daw sa kanila?
Okay, I'll just explain. There were 3 images I sent over. The first image was the report in the Foreign Policy Magazine of the U.S. 2016, dated 2016, boasting of the actual events there where they used neo-Nazi assassins, snipers, to shoot first at protesters and then at police to break down the morale of the police. shooting the protesters from the rooftops, which they kept blaming on the Yanukovych government. But in 2016, the Americans felt so confident, they came out with this report boasting that these are the heroes of the Maidan 2014 Orange Revolution. The second image I have there is Victoria Nuland in 2014 distributing among the demonstrators sandwiches, cookies, and so on, blatantly displaying American support for the demonstrations because it was a regime change operation, no different from the regime change operation in 1986 against Marcos and for an American puppet, Cory Aquino, and so on. So this is the context. And the third image that I sent, but apparently I'm not able to do it correctly, is a cartoon of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 frames. The first frame is a guy with a flag of Ukraine saying, "Okay, I will do it. I will face Russia." The second screen. The third screen is America. "You have my sword." The fourth screen is frame is, "And you have my bow and arrow," sabi ng Britannia. And the European Union in the fifth screen says, "You can have my axe." And in the last frame, it's Ukraine alone with the axe, with the sword, with a bow and arrow, but alone in the room facing Russia. That is what the Americans want to do also in Asia. Again, now it's important to explain the significance of Russia, because without Russia working with China, China would not be able to withstand the Western alliance in an attack on China, which is the ultimate goal in the American strategic plan. That is why they name China as the peer competitor and Russia as a secondary competitor. And they need a regime change in Russia in order to outflank China on this European side. So that is the entire picture for the Philippines. And the question, I think Madam Anna put very well in our previous media forum, is will we allow the Philippines to be the Ukraine of Asia? Of course, a secondary question there is Taiwan is another possible Ukraine or Asia that the Americans want to use. Now, I think my 10 minutes is up. I think that completes the picture. So back to you, Wilson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Herman Laurel, Dr. Leomil Aportadera, Ms. Ana Malindog-Uy, Dr. Romel Banlawi, and Dr. Professor Bobby Tuason. We will now give way to questions from the media. Thank you for all your... There's before the questions, may reaction dito si Senpeg Chairman Dr. Temi Rivera. Sabi niya, Dr. Leomil Aportadera, are you a historian? Thank you very much for your helpful historical background of the Ukraine crisis. This is from Senpeg think tank Chairman Dr. Temi Rivera. And sabi niya, thank you to all the other speakers for your enlightening facts to balance our views. There's a question here I will read one by one. We have one question. We have a question here from Ms. Sherry Ann Torres of ABS-CBN2. Sabi niya, Doctor, sabi niya to the speakers, aside from our trade and commerce interests with Ukraine and the same with Russia, what are other possible effects of this current crisis on us in the Philippines as a nation? Ano pa daw effects? Number 2 question, will it be beneficial to the Philippines if our government will also register its own voice or opinion about the Ukraine crisis, and how? 2 questions from Ms. Sherry Ann Torres of ABS-CBN. Before I ask Professor Tuason, Romel Banlawi, and the others to answer, I'd like to mention kanina sinabi ni Ana Malindog-Uy about the pandesal prices. It's really an issue for concern kasi last week ABS-CBN interviewed me about it. I said that based on my research, Russia is the #1 exporter of wheat in the world, and Ukraine is the fourth biggest wheat exporter in the world. And we cannot have flour or harina without wheat. So all the pandesal, all the breads and cakes need wheat. And also our instant noodles are important to the Philippines. So we'd like to invite Professor Bobby Tuason and Professor Romel Banlawi to answer Ms. Sherry Antorres' question. And the other reactors could answer also. Ang dami nagsabi, ang galing daw ninyo mag-speak, many of the reactions. Your presentations are very interesting and enlightening daw, ang daming reactions.
Yes,
Thank you, Professor
thank
Bobby Tuason.
Thank you, Wilson. I think those questions were all covered earlier, no?
Yes, covered. Can you
So
maybe summarize again?
We can ask Professor Anna later, no? But in addition to the impact on the Philippines,
Yes.
there are, as reported, about 88 OFWs in Russia today.
88, yes.
So if the tension escalates, it will be mandatory on the part of the DFA to prepare contingency measures. Although I doubt whether the tensions will escalate, because the two sides are already or will soon talk on ending the Ukrainian tension. But if it doesn't succeed, we hope it succeeds. But if it doesn't, then the crisis will continue. Now, number two, yesterday, at the United Nations Security Council, the resolution authored by the US called for the condemnation of the alleged Russian invasion, which we call intervention rather than invasion. And it was vetoed, of course, expectedly by Russia. Three others and more, including the Philippines. So it was the resolution got an abstention. Got an abstention by China, India. India, which is supposed to be an ally of the US already, but this time they went against the United Nations. And then, of course, the UAE, another American ally. And it was mentioned earlier that the Philippines joined the abstention vote. That's all I can say about the questions of Sherry Ann Torres.
Yes. Thank you, Professor Bobby Tuason. Professor Romel Banlawi, your answer to Sherry Ann Torres.
Earlier,
Pwede paki-adjust yung boses.
Increase in the price of oil and other commodities in the Philippines, and all from that we already discussed earlier, like the increase in the price of oil and other commodities in the Philippines, as well as humanitarian issues like the security of overseas Filipino contract workers, not only in Ukraine but also surrounding the Eastern Europe, and also Filipino nationals residing in Europe. We also have to take into account the geopolitical consequences and security consequences. And what are the geopolitical consequences? I'm seeing in the Ukrainian crisis the alignment of forces. It's a force between Western-style democracy as propagated by the United States and Western Europe, and also other political regimes as exemplified by Russia. And if we can read from the statement of China, China is in fact recognizing the legitimate security interest of Russia in invading Ukraine, while at the same time recognizing the principle and importance of territorial integrity and sovereignty of independent states. So, but you will see from the from the statement of China that China is supporting Russia, and even just released a statement yesterday that China will not join any sanctions against Russia. So you will see that somehow China is aligned with Russia, and what will be its security implications? The security implication is that when China takes action in Taiwan Strait, then of course China expects Russian support also, and Russia will not join the Western powers in sanctioning China if China decides to take military actions in Taiwan. Not also in Taiwan, but also in the West Philippine Sea. If China decides to take military action in the West Philippine Sea, then I expect Russia supporting China for that matter. So that is why the Philippines is also very careful in uttering our statement, the official statement, when it comes to the Ukrainian crisis, other than protecting the safety and welfare of overseas Filipino contract workers and upholding the principle of territorial integrity and sovereignty of states. But right now we are, trying to weigh the situation, because the decision that the Philippine government will take will affect our future relations, not only with the United States, but also with Russia and China, and also with countries in the Western Europe. So we have to pay closer attention on the geopolitical and security consequences of the Ukrainian crisis on the Taiwan Strait and disputes in the West Philippine Sea. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Banlawi. Si Dr. Leomil Portadera wants to answer yata, yes? Welcome.
Sir, I want to answer the question number 2 of Ma'am Sherry, relation as to adding our voice to the UN resolution. So I want to say that there's no need. Our silence is a deafening affirmation of the Philippines' independent foreign policy. Let us look at the timeline of what is happening, of what happened just before the conflict. Much as Western media wanted to term it as a Russian invasion, we have to look at the timeline. When Biden sent 3,000 specialized forces to the area of conflict before the actual war, Russia recognized the de facto republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, eventually granting them a status as sovereign states. And after the recognition of Russia of these two separatist republics, Russia signed with them a treaty of mutual aid treaty, which allowed Russia to come to the aid of these two republics in the light of possible mischiefs of the presence of the 3,000 specialized forces in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, Wilson, may I add something?
Yes.
Yeah, I would rather think of the situation of the Philippines relative to the geopolitical situation and the struggle between the unipolar world versus the emerging multipolar world. As the United States using the Philippines like Ukraine, a poke and a pawn to start conflict, like what is happening in Ukraine right now. Ukraine was at peace with Russia up to 2014 because Yanukovych was balancing between the interests of the East and the West. And that is what President Duterte is doing. And our fear is that if the next administration, and thankfully it's not going to happen apparently by the trends now, we would have a Lacson or a Robredo or a ISCO administration that would work with the United States to create destabilizing situations and lead to a U.S. engineered accident or compromising situation. So that is the concern that we have in relation to the political aspects of the Ukraine situation. Let's look at the solution to Ukraine's dilemma. It cannot win against Russia. The West does not want to send its troops in. Therefore, we can see the gimmick of the Americans. You go die first, and we'll be the last to join you. I hope we're not that stupid again as we were during Noy Noy's time. That I want to stress very clearly. Asia is at peace and on the road to prosperity. There will be no conflict in the South China Sea unless the Americans create a false flag that Filipinos fall for. The future of the South China Sea is compromise, dialogue, and joint ventures as we have in the Reed Bank. I think that there should be a period to that, not a question mark, but a period. China will not start a war, will not start a fire, will not start a conflagration in its own neighborhood.
Thank you very much,
Wilson.
Mr. Laurel. Miss Ana Malindog-Uy, for your short
Yeah.
answer. Then we have many questions. Thank you.
Okay. Just for the first question, again, I reiterate, disruption of the global supply market, which should lead to inflation. That would mean oil inflation. So it will affect our commodities here, and it will surge the prices higher, and all of us will be affected because our purchasing power will be weakened. When you talk about purchasing power, it means the capacity of a person to buy goods in the market. So that's one very important thing I think that we need to think about, and I think the president and the other members or other officials has to think about. But then again, there's an ongoing impending negotiation and going back to the negotiating table that's happening right now. So I hope that that kind of positive development will gain traction because that will be good for the whole world. Second question, Philippines, what's the stand with regards to Ukraine crisis? I think it's very clear, no? The Philippines stand neutral on all these things. And I think that's good position. Why? Because as I've said in other forums, let us not add fuel to the fire. So, and at the same time, I think the United States has to understand our position and other countries as well. There's no point in siding with anyone, no, on all these things, because again, it's not as if like we need to calibrate as well the positioning of the Philippines. But I think I agree with the president in this aspect that we are neutral in all of this, and we're not trying to muddle the situation. And because it's not easy for us. But one thing that we have to remember, it's not only the Philippines, no? There are other countries also who express their, how do you call that? They're not really siding with Russia, but frustration with NATO's expansion in the eastern part of Europe. You have Cuba in there, you have Venezuela, you have Iran. Iran actually spoke in a meeting of oil-producing countries saying that, let's disregard the Western sanction. These are cruel and unnatural U.S. sanctions. So Iran is also, Pakistan actually visited Russia recently, even if there's a Ukraine crisis. And Pakistan was very excited talking to President Putin. Myanmar also expressed, that, Myanmar position is they are not in favor of NATO's expansion as well in the borders of Russia. India has a neutral position, I think, or it's abstaining in the UN Security Council. You have China. Even Turkey is trying to balance its position as well. And one thing as well, as I've mentioned earlier, UAE is also abstained. But all these countries actually, there's one thing common. Go back to the negotiating table, talk, de-escalate tension, and let diplomacy resume. I think that's the message of all of this, at the end of the day. Because wars, you don't have winners in there. Everyone is a loser in a war. So that's my position. And that's my opinion and answer to the question. Many thank you.
And I
thank
add
you
something, a
Professor Bobby
quick
Tuason.
addition, Wilson. Yes,
Thank you.
it's interesting to know that the United Nations General Assembly will be convening today.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
To deal with
Can
the
we see your
Ukraine,
video, Professor? Sana we
Ukraine
could see your
crisis.
video.
No, I'm sorry. I just found that out this morning. So they are convening, but however, this is the
Yes.
any resolution that will be filed and approved upon at the level of the General Assembly cannot be enforced.
Yes.
It cannot be
Thank
enforced
you.
kasi hindi mandatory yan.
Yes.
Thank you.
It's just, thank you very much, Professor
It's an
Bobby
expression.
Tuason.
UN resolution is an expression, but it's not mandatory and it's not enforceable. No, it's the UN Security Council that actually can enforce. But the thing here is, in the UN Security Council, it has to be a consensus decision, meaning all the 5 security member states has to say yes. If one vetoes, the resolution is dead. So that's how it is in the international level. No.
Thank you very much. There's a reaction here from University of the Philippines, Professor Roland Simbulan, also official siya ng Senpeg think tank. Sabi ni Professor Simbulan, look at the double standards. When President Putin invaded Ukraine, everyone is shouting invasion. When the US NATO forces invaded and occupied Afghanistan, Iraq, and intervened in Iraq and Syria, the Western media did not call it an invasion, but they authorized it as a form of so-called humanitarian intervention. End of quotation marks. This is from UP Professor Roland Simbulan, and official of Senpeg. Thank you very much. There's a question here from SMNI journalist, Miss Kay Austria. Can we invite her to ask her questions to our speakers? Miss Kay Austria of SMNI.
Yes, good morning, sir. Good morning,
Good
ma'am
morning.
and sirs. Council from SMNA po. First question ko po is, since the national election is near, what is the importance that our future leader will remain neutral among other countries, especially amid the tensions po na nararamdaman po natin ngayon?
That's very good question for our speakers and the actors. How important daw?
I'm sorry, but medyo malayo sa forum natin ito, but maybe I can answer that later by
Yes.
email. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. May I answer, Wilson?
Yes, Professor Romel
yeah.
Manlawi.
It's very important for presidential aspirants to express their policy on how they can implement economic measures to overcome the economic consequences of the Ukrainian crisis. And if they are elected, they need to have a strong economic blueprint to ameliorate the conditions of the Filipino people as a result of the harsh economic impact of the Ukrainian crisis. So especially with the skyrocketing prices of oil. So it's very important for presidential aspirants and future presidents to handle the issue of oil prices, because the prices of oil will affect all commodities in the Philippines. So that's it. And second, also a sound foreign policy blueprint, on how to deal with the geopolitical implications arising from the Ukrainian conflict. That's all. Thank you, Wilson.
Professor Romel saka Professor Plason, may sinabi si Kay Austria about the importance of being neutral daw of the next president, about neutrality.
In fact,
can you comment on it now?
During the Cold War, we already articulated a policy of neutrality when we joined the non-aligned movement. In fact, the 1987 Constitution that mandates the pursuance of independent foreign policy is in fact also an expression of the neutrality. And even before the adoption of the 1987 Constitution, during the time of former President Ferdinand Marcos, he already implemented such kind of diversification of our foreign policy. It was former President Marcos who opened our gates to former Soviet Union and other socialist states in the world, while at the same time strengthening our relationship with countries adopting a Western-style democracy. But at the same time, the former President Ferdinand Marcos also designed a political system that he thinks will cater to the particular characteristic of the Philippine society. And that's the kind of policy we need to have after the May 2022 elections, to broaden our relationship with all powers, and at the same time strengthen our relationship with our neighbors, especially our ASEAN neighbors. Okay, and of course, close to our ASEAN neighbors is of course China. Okay, and then India. So that's the good thing about neutrality. We are not taking sides in any political competition or ideological competition among powers, okay? Because we want to be friendly to all nations of the world. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wilson, there's
Uh-uh.
a question
Follow
from Temi Rivera.
Yes. Pero before, may follow-up question lang si Miss K. Austria, then we'll call Professor Temi Rivera. Pwede. May follow-up lang si Miss K. Austria.
Okay.
Yes, follow-up question. And then Professor Temi Rivera, Chairman of CENTEC, will comment.
Yes po. Can we compare Ukraine and Philippines po? Can we say that Vladimir Zelensky is a Manchurian candidate? As Mr. Bobby Watson po said earlier, kasi Zelensky is pro-US. In choosing the next president, Mr. Herman Laurel last forum mentioned that we have a Manchurian candidate daw po.
Again, Kay?
Ang tanong ni Kay, can the Philippines be compared to like Ukraine being used by a superpower against another superpower daw? Is our situation dangerously almost the same daw, sabi ni Ms. Kay Austria?
Currently, the government is pursuing a balancing strategy, tiptoeing between the US and China. So it approximates an independent foreign policy. And therefore, I don't know how we can compare that with the case of Zelensky. But of course, Zelensky has been the long-time recipient of NATO military assistance, missiles, etc., and also from the US, because the US leads the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So that's how it is. Very difficult to really absolutely compare Ukraine with the Philippines right now.
Yes. Si Professor Romel yata?
Yes, for me,
For
me, it's very inappropriate to compare the Philippines with Ukraine because first, the Philippines does not have a threat of invasion from any country. What we are experiencing in the West Philippines is not a threat of invasion, but a case of territorial dispute and maritime jurisdictional conflicts that can be resolved peacefully as mandated by the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea and other existing international laws. So for me, it's very inappropriate to do that. Then regarding the issue of Manchurian candidate, I think it's an exaggeration, an exaggeration to use the term Manchurian candidate as if there's one country, trying to install a leader according to their own image. But there will be some influences coming from other foreign countries. We call that the influence politics. But I don't think I don't buy the idea of a Manchurian candidate. Maybe we will elect a president in May who is friendlier to the United States or friendlier to China. But I don't think we will have a Zelensky type of leader that will be very, very pro-American and anti-Russian. In among the candidates that we are facing, in the May 2022 elections, I can see that all of them have the intention to also fashion a good relationship with the two major powers, United States and China. But they have differences on the details, like the issue of how to settle disputes with China and the issue of the 2016 international arbitration decision. But in general, all candidates, presidential candidates, have the intention to cultivate good, friendly, and close relations with China and the United States.
Thank you. We'd like to call, thank you very much, Dr. Romel Banla. We'd like to call Professor Temi Rivera for his reaction. And then later on, we'll call PTV4 journalist Ms. Bea Bernardo for questions. Dr. Temi Rivera, Chairman of CENPEG.
Thank you, Wilson. Just a few comments. Well, we are all hoping, of course, that the crisis will eventually end up being resolved through diplomatic political negotiations, no? And I anticipate two very important talking points. One is the question of neutrality or making Ukraine some kind of a buffer state. No,
Like Finland.
that's one
Yes.
serious talking point. But as you know, Russia has long desired some ironclad guarantee from both
Yes.
NATO and the US, which has not
Yes.
been forthcoming, no? And which has,
Yes.
of course, contributed to the crisis as we are now experiencing. Second, what do you do about the eastern region of the Ukraine, where in the Luhansk and Donetsk area, where,
Yes.
as we all know, you have a majority of Russian-speaking people, no? I think a practical talking point there, and this was already included in the Minsk agreement, is to provide substantial autonomy, no? Because otherwise, kasi ayaw din ng Ukraine yung outright separatism, no? But I think mas practical na talking point yung substantial autonomy, no? And let's hope they agree to that, both parties. The third point that I would like to comment on briefly is the position of neutrality, no? And most of the comments so far, I think, are coming from a country-state perspective. We need a more nuanced, but also a more morally courageous understanding of neutrality. And what is lacking, I think, is that we should have the moral courage to condemn any kind of the use of force in settling inter-country relations. No? Kasi pag hindi malinaw yung message na yon, what will happen to any kind of, hopefully, wag na sana mangyari, no? You have all kinds of conflicts taking place, no? And, well, this may be a very ideal position, but from the point of view of the people, that is the only morally and perhaps even politically correct point to stress. As much as possible, we should avoid any use of force in settling our differences with our neighbors, with other countries. So, yun ang parang dissatisfaction ko, no? Pag sinabi mo lang simple na, oh, neutral tayo, neutral tayo. I don't think that is enough, no? Yun lang, no? Whether the use of force is coming from the West or from China or from Russia or any other country, the only morally desirable position, I think, is to condemn it.
Wilson,
Yun
Thank you.
lang ang points ko, no?
Thank you, Professor Temi Rivera. Mr. Laurel,
His
yes.
point, and also who says but war is unjustifiable and so on and so forth.
Thank
But
you.
there has long been a principle of the just war, because you cannot avoid war when there are war-like states and there are clashing interests of states that have the capacity to wage war. So let's be realistic. It is going to be in our history. It has been in our history in the past. It will be there today and tomorrow, unless the world comes together. You have the UN Convention on these issues, but war still continues. And in the current stage of our history, it is the United States that has been waging war the past 20 years, 25 years. The last sign of that is now Ukraine. Previously, it was the exit of the Americans from Afghanistan, because this is an era of the US attempt to impose its unipolar world in the 21st century. I'm going back to stress the strategic plan they made in 1995, Project for a New American Century. That is the start and end of all these problems today. And what Putin, in waging, if we call it a war, waging this war, has put at least a pause to the American idea and thought that they can still impose it. That is why it is heroic for Putin to do this. And
May I comment, Wilson, also? No?
Thank you.
Beneficiary.
Thank you.
Because without the domination of Russia, which of course Kissinger said, The US and Russia should become friends in order to confront China. Without
Thank
this
you.
domination of Russia by the US, they cannot attack Asia. Yeah.
Thank you. Tapos short comment by Professor.
Yeah, short
Natas,
comment. Yeah, I have no illusion, of course, about the harsh realities of the international global system. My point is, we need a new moral compass, no? And this can only come from the intervention by the peoples of the world themselves. You know, American people, the Russian people, the Chinese people. I'm sure they will not support any kind of war that will completely demolish, no, their own countries and sovereignties. So even while we continue to live, unfortunately, I realize that in a very harsh international global situation where major powers seem to have the ascendancy all the time, this should not prevent us from asserting that people's viewpoint, no? And especially because we work with an organization like SANPEG, we would like to assume that that should be the starting point. No, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Let me add something,
yes.
Wilson, very quick.
Yes. Yes.
In fact, good points raised by our chairman, Temi Rivera.
Yes.
In fact, there are at least two international movements today against the new Cold War perpetrated by the US. No? And I think locally in the Philippines, we have a peace movement, also anti-war movement. No? The only thing, of course, how do you make their voices louder to be heard by the superpowers? It's a struggle itself. You want to build a new international system, you have to struggle for it.
Thank you. That's a very good point. Professor, maybe we could have another session anti-Cold War, yes.
It's quite simplistic to just state that we want peace. Everybody wants peace, but peace cannot be achieved as stated by Brian Becker of the Anti-War Coalition in the United States. Even the multipolar world does not ensure peace. It is only global socialism, but that's an entirely bigger discussion.
Today,
every nation is trying to fight only for its interest.
Yeah, but I'd like to make you aware, Mento, that the No to Cold War movement is actually led by socialists.
Yeah.
Again.
Thank you. We could have another session on that. Very good. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the good reminders. No Cold War movement. There's a question here from PTB4.
Wilson.
Miss Bea Bernardo.
Hello po, good morning.
Yes.
Hello po. Kay Professor Banlawi po, pero anyone po can react naman po. In an interview, sinabi po ni Professor Banlawi na possible na mag-create ng new risk sa Asia and West Philippine Sea, yung Russia and Ukraine crisis. Pwede pong pa-expound on this matter. And ano po yung pwedeng gawin ng security sector ng Pilipinas para ma-avoid itong conflict na to?
Yes. Thank you, Miss Bea Bernardo, PTB4.
Thank you, Bea. I'm talking about the new risks. First, on the Taiwan Strait, because China is also increasing its military activities in that area, and China's position on Ukraine crisis will also give a clue to Russian position if China decides to escalate its military activities in the Taiwan Strait. So we have to be prepared for that, because China is now getting, support, from Russia. Meron siyang friend to support China on whatever actions China will take in the Taiwan Strait. And also that is causing me anxiety on China's increased military activities and even paramilitary activities in the South China Sea. And that is why we need to cultivate a deeper, friendlier relationship with China and sustain our efforts of promoting a comprehensive strategic cooperation with China in order to have understanding with China that China will not take any military actions in the South China Sea that is inimical to our existing friendly bilateral relationship.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Professor Bobby Tuason, would you like to address the question of Ms. Bea Bernardo? about Taiwan Strait and all that?
Well, we know for a fact that Taiwan belongs to China. That's indisputable. Nobody should disagree with that. It's a part of China. And China has been patiently pursuing a peaceful reunification with Taiwan, only to be deterred and impinged upon by the US, as a pressure point. But I don't think the US will go to war with China, neither with Russia, as several scientific studies coming from the RAND Corporation and the Pentagon itself, when they studied the scenarios of future wars with China or Russia, they found out that the US will lose. The US will lose.
Yes.
And in fact, the Ukraine crisis will lead to a new international system. It will promote and fuel a new international system that will eventually, probably years from now, if not decades, will eventually lead to the fall of the American empire. So the world system is now changing. China is on the rise. Russia in Europe is also on the rise. There is supposed to be a military alliance between, but some scholars say they're not. They're in fact, even if there's no formal military alliance, Russia and China are in fact more than allies, because they are allies and partners comprehensively.
Wilson?
Yes.
Yeah, let me comment.
Would you like to answer? Yes, comment on the answer.
Yeah. I would like to comment first on the questions of I think one thing is important na hindi pa nababanggit is the question of Gay of SMNI earlier asking about our national leader and this coming election. I think one important thing that we have to remember when you talk about geopolitics, international relations, that the next leader should be someone who really understands these things. I think who should have knowledge, experience, and even understanding, really, in-depth understanding of the geopolitical situation that is happening, not only in that part of the world which have a crisis right now, but even in this part of the world. No, because when you talk about leader, they make decisions. And of course, the president is the sole architect of foreign policy. So in that sense alone, the president has huge responsibility in crafting that kind of foreign policy that is sound. But at the same time, we have to remember that the 1987 Constitution also mandates that the foreign policy of this country should be an independent foreign policy. Now, as to the details of that, it will be up to the next president, because we have already seen how President Duterte navigated and implemented his concept of foreign policy. And I think that's very important for all of us, the voters, to really remember that. On the other hand, with regards to neutrality, I would agree that neutrality is not just a simple neutrality. I think there should be basis about it. And I think there should be, at the end of the day, kasi when I think about neutrality, I always think that, okay, we're neutral, but on the other hand, there's basis to it. The basis should be the national and core security and national interest of this country. Yun lang yun. And if that will be compromised, then you have to make a position. So ang neutrality dito is not really an absolute sense. If you really look at in real politics, let's talk about real politics here, no? Because what you're saying is too ideal. But the real politics, the realities on the ground are totally different as well. So for me, the way I see it, the national government, especially the president, has to uphold the national core interests of this country. And from there, let's negotiate with these superpowers how we can navigate. But at the end of the day as well, let's consider what's in the 1987 Constitution, which is an independent foreign policy. I think those two are very important. No, And in terms of trying to compare naman, how do you call that, Ukraine and the Philippines, there are similarities in terms of position, geopolitical positioning, geography. Because if you look at the Philippines, we're also very close to China. In some ways, if you look at China, I mean, if we will be used as a country, as a launching pad on any eventualities that will happen in the region, we're like Ukraine. But that is not happening precisely because I don't think China will wage an invasion on us. China is not an enemy. China is a friend. We have differences in the South China Sea, but take note, the differences in the South China Sea is not only a difference between China and the Philippines. There are other claimant states in there. No, you have Taiwan even, and you have also you have Vietnam. No, also it should be looked at that, no, in a broader sense. Huwag yung masyadong focus lang tayo between the Philippines and China. On another note naman, on the aspect of Taiwan, tama si Professor Bobby. Taiwan is talagang part of China. If you look at the constitution of both countries, it recognizes that Taiwan is a province of China. And I think that's very important for the national leaders and the next administration to see it. Because there's such a thing as one China policy, which is recognized by the United Nations and should be respected. I think that's my point in all of those discussions that has been pushed and then been discussed earlier. Thank you.
Yeah, Wilson, pasok lang ako sandali. Wilson.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
I agree with Wilson. There is so much more to discuss from stemming from this Ukraine versus Russia versus NATO experience that the world has. And I agree with the Temi and Bobby that peace, and I think Simbulan is there in the chat room, that peace is the ultimate goal because the victims are the peoples of the world. Yes. But let us be realistic about it. Global peace will become permanent and durable only if the global economic system is not based on competition of states, but on sharing of states, which is the advocacy of China in its community of shared future for mankind. Let's schedule 2 or 3 more discussions on broader issues. Now, for example, the sharing world. Now, we do not have a sharing world. In fact, the unipolar push of the US is still America first and only. People should understand that. Number 2, the second point I want to make is about the Manchurian candidate. Obviously, we have had Manchurian candidates and presidents from the time of Quezon to the time of Rojas to the time of Magsaysay. Garcia had the Filipino first policy, more or less trying to break out, but Macapagal came in, and so on. And the peak was when Marcos was trying to develop the fledgling independent state. The Americans intervened again and placed another Manchurian candidate, Cory Aquino, and so on. Yes, today there are at least 3 openly Manchurian candidates for the Americans in this election. Very clear by their statements, and we can quote it, but we don't have time now. There is only one that has been clearly independent in his statements. But we will not go into the politics of this campaign. No?
Okay. We'll have another session on anti-Cold War. Thank you.
Wilson, just one sentence.
Yes.
Yes. Short. Yes. With regards to China, and the Philippines, and this tension, and that tension here in the South China Sea. There's one thing that we always have to remember: in every action, there's an equal reaction. So whatever we do, ganun lang yun kasimple in geopolitics and real politics, no. Kung anong gagawin natin in relation to the dynamics ng mga external powers in the South China Sea. And then China will react based on our action. So we always have to remember that. That's very basic, no? That's what I want to emphasize as well, no?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now we'd like to close the session. It is very enlightening, very animated, and very hindi pa dapat. And thank you very much to Dr. Temi Rivera, Chairman of CENPEG, for reminding us, and also Professor Bobby Tuason about there's an anti-Cold War movement. Maybe we could have a discussion on that separately and other issues. We'd like to invite all the speakers to give their closing statement to summarize their point. The Ukraine crisis and its impact on the Philippines and Asia. Short sana para for everyone, and then we'll have another session of this. You have so many, alam mo, Professor, sorry to interrupt you. Akala ko I know already a lot about this issue. Listening to you and all of you, parang it's always additional crash course on history and geopolitics. Like, Professor, you used in your statement kanina bipolar. Narinig ko lang yan sa ibang tao, psychological impairment yun para bipolar. Sabi naman niya, multipolar, sabi ni Mr. Herman Lauren. Natutuwa ko. And to Mr. Romeo Balawi. Your closing statement, Professor Bobby Tuason, and then later on, Professor Romel Banlawi.
Thank you very much again to Wilson, our partner also in forums, for taking time to organize this. It is a bold initiative on the part of Wilson, part of Pandesal Forum to
Yes.
to organize this media forum, and I hope everyone, especially our friends from the media, were able to somehow grasp the intricacies and the ramifications of the Ukraine crisis, so that anytime, however, you can always email us if you have further questions. So congratulations to this forum again. And let me reiterate something that I mentioned earlier, that it should be interesting to watch this ongoing Ukraine crisis. Hopefully, it will end in a diplomatic negotiation. The reason there is that you're looking at the unfolding of a new international world system, where you see the hypocrisy and double standards of the West, led by the U.S., in meddling into the affairs of Europe and also elsewhere in the world. But on the other hand, you see the diplomatic track being pursued by China itself. China has been calling for diplomatic negotiation. It is also calling for the implementation of the Minsk agreement, which Ukraine has failed to honor. No? So those are the things, those are the scenarios coming up, and I hope that can also be covered by the next media forum that has been suggested on Wilson to take up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Bobby Tuason, Director for Policy Studies of Center for People Empowerment in Good Governance. Next is Dr. Romel Banlawi, Chairman, Philippine Institute for Peace, Violence, and Terrorism, for his closing statement.
Thank you, Wilson. Kaparis ng pandesal mo at mga benta mo sa Kamuning Bakery. Yung forum na ito ay masarap balik-balikan. So we look forward to more forum like this, and congratulations for your efforts to organize an activity like this to raise the awareness of our people on the significance of the Ukrainian crisis for Philippine security. But I would like to stress the imperative of ending the Ukrainian crisis as soon as possible, because the more we prolong the armed conflict in Ukraine, it will be disastrous, not only for the people of Ukraine, but also for the entire world. It is also disastrous for the United States, because I am examining the impact of American sanctions against Russia. You know, it's not only Russian businessmen that are affected. In fact, even American businessmen are affected. So the more you put sanction against Russia, the more it will hurt the global economy, and so the Philippines also. So we need a immediate peaceful resolution of the Ukrainian crisis. And I agree with the statement of Bobby. The aftermath of the Ukrainian crisis will usher in a new era of global order. So let's see how this global order will unfold. But definitely, the Ukrainian crisis tells us that we are now officially in the post-American world. Thank you.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. Officially post-American world. Wow. Very interesting itong dalawang speakers natin for your very enlightening crash courses on geopolitics and history. And next, we'd like to ask the reactors for their short closing statements about the talks of our two panelists and the topic. Professor Ana Malindog-Uy.
Yes, thank you, Wilson, for inviting me. Actually, we talked about this forum, and I think it's a success, and I think it brings awareness to our kababayans, no? Because this issue is very complicated. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, it's a very complicated issue. It has historical background, and so what I would like to message to our kababayans is to look at the issue in all aspects, not just one side, but both sides and look at the historical background to that, so that we will have a deeper understanding. And at the same time, what is very important, as the title of this forum dictates, is we learn lessons from the experience of Ukraine and the experience of Russia and other countries who are involved in this. And from that kind of experience, we draw lesson. And I think that lesson should serve and should be used to our advantage, not to our disadvantage, no, but to our advantage. And I think leaders upcoming, the next administration has to take all of this, what is happening here, and make it more like parang a springboard to come up with a very sound foreign policy that respects the national interests of this country and respect the Constitution at the same time. And we should at least not be neutral in a sense that we don't side with any superpower, because that is not to our advantage. And I hope and I pray that the next president will be very adept in this kind of issues. But at the same time, I pray and I hope that the Ukraine crisis would de-escalate. And I think, and I really hope that the peace negotiations or whatever negotiation that is impending right now between Ukraine and Russia will be successful, will gain traction. Because at the end of the day, ang kawawa po dito talaga, my experience working in the conflict zone for 10 years is the civilian and the humanitarian crisis. And that's not what we want to see in this world, given that we still have a pandemic that we're trying to confront. Thank you very much to everyone, and mabuhay po.
Thank you, Ana Balindog-Uy. Next, we'd like to call Dr. Leomil Aportadera of University of San Agustin, Iloilo, to give his closing statement. Thank you, Professor. Sabi ni Dr. Taime Rivera, akala niya historian daw kayo. Kasi very enlightening daw your historical background there. Sabi nung Senpeg chairman. Thank you.
In my reaction to
Are you historian daw? You did not answer pala his question. He's asking, are you also a historian daw? Kasi natutuwa siya sa presentation niya.
Being an historian is to be defined by someone who studies history. I can be that historian under that definition. But going to my in my reaction to this today's talk, I mentioned of two doctrines: the very well-known Monroe Doctrine and the evolving Putin Doctrine. The Philippines was an unintended beneficiary of the Monroe Doctrine, geared towards the reimposition of colonization in South America. Our leaders in the 19th century took inspiration from the independence movement in South America, that before the end of that century, the Philippines became Asia's first republic. I am of the belief that the Putin Doctrine will outlast the Russian-Ukraine conflict. So in a nutshell, this Putin Doctrine will see before us a more assertive and even confrontational Russia. And what is our resort to it but to go by our constitution, the provision of our constitution, to abide with an independent foreign policy. When elephants trample, get out of the way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Leomil Aportadera. Good reminder. If elephants quarrel, get out of the way. Last but not the least, Mr. Herman Laurel, Director of Philbrick Strategic Studies, for his closing statement. Paki-unmute si Mr. Herman Laurel, please.
Okay, the new world we are facing and we are entering is a win-win multipolar world. In Ukraine will win if its neutrality is guaranteed by NATO and Russia and by itself. That is win-win. Russia wins that way. European Union wins that way, and eventually European Union can kick the Americans out without NATO, which is the one keeping Americans in Europe, and that's the intention. Here in Asia, we are winning already. RCEP is helping us win. We will continue with prosperity. And all the other problems will be met through dialogue and compromise and win-win. So I think that's what our next forum should be, the win-win multipolar world.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Herman Laurel. for reminding us we should have multipolar world. Tapos natuwa ako, sabi ni Bobby Tuason kanina, bipolar. Kasi in my column in Philippine Star yesterday, may sinabi si Manny Pacquiao about bipolar. Something
ibang bipolar ata
not
yun.
bipolar na.
Ibang bipolar ata yun, Wilson.
Iba naman bipolar kaya na ano ako.
Psychological
thank you very
yun.
much to
Psychological
all our great
yan.
speakers. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the very outstanding, very enlightened. Alam mo, ang dami nag-message sa akin na very grateful to Professor Bobby Tuason of CENPEG, Dr. Romel Banlawi of Philippine Institute for Peace, Violence, and Terrorism, to Professor Ana Malindog-Uy of Philbrick Strategic Studies, Dr. Leomil Aportadera, and Mr. Herman Laurel of Philbrick Strategic Studies for this very enlightening, thought-provoking, and very balanced analysis and perspectives about this global headline news event of Ukraine crisis. That's very, thank you very much, and encouraging the public and the Philippines and our leaders to hopefully uphold really independent foreign policy that is pro-Philippines and not be caught between two elephants or three elephants. Alam nyo, thank you very much for the reminder. Hopefully, our pandesal prices will remain affordable here at Kamuning Bakery at sa buong Pilipinas. And also, as a good reminder lang, alam nyo, Kamuning Bakery is a small bakery, but we have two suppliers, the biggest in the country, San Miguel Mill and Philippine Foremost Milling. Sabi ng taga-office, why do you have to have two big suppliers when you're a very small bakery? Sabi nung staff ko sa office, sabi ko, alam mo, you cannot rely on only one big supplier. Walang biro to ha. When there was a time, somebody in our office si Grace, na delay lang ng 1 week mag-order sa isang big supplier, the other supplier tumawag, uy, galit ba kayo sa amin? Bakit kayo na-delay ng 1 week from the usual schedule of ordering? Do you want lower price? Anything we could do? Even though we are a very small bakery, we have two big suppliers and they know they are not the only supplier. So they are both good to and nice to us. So Philippines is like that also. Thank you very
parang
much.
Yun ang dinidescribe mo. Pilipinas ang dinidescribe mo.
Dapat tayo na all of them should be befriending us, courting us. Hindi tayo pwede owned by only one supplier. Na kahit ang basura itapon sa'yo, kahit anong presyo, wala kang choice.
Hindi talaga
Thank you very
no?
much. Yes. Thank you very much again to the very outstanding intellectuals who spoke here. And thank you to our media friends. We will send you the recording of this to everyone, including Professor Tuason and everyone, and Professor Banlawi, Ms. Ana Malindog-Uy, Dr. Leomil Aportadera, and Mr. Herman Laurel. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Thank you everyone.
Thank you very much.
Sa susunod.